So thank you, everyone. It's really wonderful to see you all. And thank you for such a warm welcome, Vanessa. I'm delighted to be here to open the third Sheffield Urbanism Lecture Series. I realise that I've been working with the concept of co-production in one way or another for nearly 20 years. So I'm putting this question forward: why should urbanists care about co-production? Because it is one that I've been asking myself. I hope to advance some potential answers, but I certainly don't pretend to have them all. So I want to start with the provocation that urban studies as a field has not had enough to say about co-production. Individual scholars have written up case studies and analyses of their own experiences, but much co-produced research takes place in other cognate disciplines and terrains. Specific takes on co-production can be seen within political science and administration, for instance, drawing on Elinor Ostrom's work, and focused on both changing modes of governance and service management and delivery. STS scholars, such as Sheila Yasinoff, have focused on the co-constitution of science with society, with earlier work from Michael Gibbons, Helga Novotny, and Peter Scott, emphasising changing modes of knowledge production, which prioritise context of application, the fragmentation of expertise, distributed authority, and transdisciplinarity. Co-production has a strong foundation within development studies, with scholars Vanessa Watson and Diana Mitlin, for instance, advancing understanding of co-production as a strategy for empowerment of the urban poor, or more just urban planning. Similarly, theoretical and empirical studies of co-production are central within environmental transitions literature through the lens of transdisciplinarity, or with a focus on new experiments such as urban living labs. So the urban is often the location for these studies, present but rarely central. And as an urbanist working with co-production, this has had the effect of distributing my work across multiple disciplines. So in asking then, why should urbanists care about co-production, I'm not only responding to my own internal critic and some of the strengths and limitations that I've encountered in my years of experience, but also trying to put forward and position co-production within critical urban studies as an act of consolidation, clarification, and reframing. So I want to suggest that this question matters for two reasons. First, the discourse of co-production is in part being driven by exogenous factors. Increasingly in the competitive higher education landscape, co-production is an expectation from funders that shapes the conditions in which we do our work. To some extent, co-production has become an unspecified, conceptually obscure, methodologically vague external demand from some funders without any real understanding of what is required. And second, I tentatively suggest that critical urban studies has had a bit of a problem with co-production. In my experience, I have encountered many different views about co-production, from a very strong embrace to a strong rejection. And I've certainly felt the suspicions of others over the last 20 years that co-productive research is soft, lesser, not proper social science. So in part, I contend that this reluctance to analyse co-production from within urban studies inheres in uncertainty about the relationship between critique and engagement, a point to which I hope to return later. So to give you a quick overview of the journey I hope to take us on today, I'm going to treat the question, why should urbanists care about co-production, as a provocation. First, I will look back at why I started to care about co-production during the early 2000s, as a critique of the narrow, technologically instrumental framing of the impact agenda within the context of the knowledge-based economy, and the limited and often self-interested ways that universities saw their roles in relation to urban development. I'll give an overview then of how I sought to respond to this critique, learning by doing through a series of funded projects and programmes of work. I'll then suggest 5 potential answers to the question. First, co-production describes how cities are being continuously made and unmade, and so it contains perhaps the possibility to rethink and engage with a different ontology of the city. Second, co-production is being claimed as participatory urban governance and demanded as the right to the city. And as critical scholars, it's necessary then for us to understand how this is happening and with what effects. And third, co-production is a strategy to realise urban epistemic justice, requiring different tactics and practices of knowledge mobilisation. Fourth, I'll suggest that co-production is one response then to the need for new epistemologies of the urban through the co-production of critique. And finally, co-production is a refusal to bracket how we do our research from the institutional conditions required to do it. In the final part of the lecture then, I will turn to the limits of co-production, including its contradictory epistemic myopia, conceptual muddiness, consensus fallacy, and necessity but insufficiency when dealing with powerful groups, vested interests, global funding regimes, and obdurate institutions. So it's precisely because of these limits that I conclude we should care about co-production, and we should stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway writes, but not through an uncritical embrace, rather through positioning co-production within the broader field of urban epistemics. So why did I start to care about co-production? I start this story in some ways with my own ambivalence about being an academic in the first place. I used to have this narrative that I didn't so much choose to be an academic, choose this career, as just forget to leave school. My ambivalence came from always getting a huge amount of satisfaction and reward from intellectual work, underpinned by an insatiable curiosity, but at the same time being deeply vexed by injustices in society. So I therefore came into academia with a personal stake in understanding this relationship between academic excellence and societal relevance. And in the first part of my career, I spent time working in a research centre seeking to bridge this gap. And it's through these early experiences that I developed a critique with Professor Tim May, now at Cardiff University, that subsequently led me to my interest in co-production. In the early 2000s, the discourse of the knowledge economy was becoming a new demand to which cities and universities were increasingly being expected to respond. As a response, we undertook a range of projects around science cities, the regionalisation of science policy and innovation corridors. And we very quickly hit limits, the knowledge economy. Here was an idea circulating without any real content or systematic reflection on what would actually be needed for universities to contribute to their cities. What we saw was a proliferation of studies seeking to capture the economic value of universities and contribution as if their location, their attraction to students and their spending power was simply enough. These ideas aligned with those of people like Richard Florida, heavily critiqued notion of the creative city, which was translated locally in places like Manchester into concepts like the Ideopolis or the knowledge capital, where there were these checklists of ingredients that cities needed to have in order to be successful in international league tables, an airport, a service sector, a university. Part of the rationale was the long correlation between science and economic development over the longue durée. One US Senator, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, is attributed with saying, if you want to build a great city, create a great university and wait 200 years. So around 2005 to 2006, we were commissioned by the 4 universities of Greater Manchester to map the contributions they made to the city region. As part of this project, we interviewed senior management in universities, one of which had just received a relatively large amount of funding from the Northwest Regional Development Agency in recognition of the potential of the university to foster urban development. During an interview, I asked the then Vice-Chancellor what they would do differently as a result of having bent and captured regional development monies for academic research. The answer was nothing. Universities were positioning themselves as part of what academics John Logan and Harvey Mollich have called growth coalitions for the knowledge economy, accessing funds intended for urban regeneration. Yet apparently this required no changes in modes of operation. Not long previously, I had been doing work in Hume in Manchester, a struggling inner city neighbourhood on the fringes of 2 universities. We had been commissioned to look at the legacies of subsequent regeneration projects, and these projects certainly had transformed the physical fabric of Hume, but by moving residents to the outskirts, by moving students in, and by building new campuses with shiny new buildings. So it's the juxtaposition of these kinds of projects that led to the critique Tim and I developed then in 2 books. So first, Cities and the Knowledge Economy, Promise, Politics and Possibility, published in 2018. In this book, we highlighted the danger of building a knowledge economy for the few and not the many. Against the backdrop of a movement from a manufacturing to service economy, the knowledge economy became a kind of mobilizing image for cities to create opportunities in their futures. And the promise rested upon the concentration of services and economies of scale through generating a critical mass of expertise intended to lead to innovation and wealth creation. Yet we argued that the promise of the knowledge economy could not be realized by just a recipe for success in an uncertain world. Rather than enhancing democratic aspirations by, for instance, bringing political control closer to citizens, the knowledge economy was being implemented as a technocratic fix to enhance the efficiency of urban political apparatuses to pursue particular economic agendas. And we weren't the only ones raising these kinds of questions about, for instance, the extent that people from poorer backgrounds with perhaps adverse childhood experiences would have the chance to go to university, about who gets the jobs that are created, or whether the knowledge economy just sees local communities relegated to serving coffee to students and staff in overpriced cafes, or pushed out of their own neighbourhoods to build student accommodation in prime city locations. And academics were often deeply embedded in and reproduced these discourses of knowledge-based growth as a means to justify their own existence or sell their models of, for instance, triple helices or science parks to decision makers. And of course, there were others who critiqued the science or smart city trend as a high-tech fantasy or Frankenstein urbanism, as Doreen Massey or Federico Cugarello wrote respectively. So second then, with the centrality of knowledge to economic and social life, we turn to examine the conditions for knowledge production within the academy. Part of the problem is that universities have focused on what they can do as strategic actors, as businesses, as landowners. But what makes a university distinctive from, for example, a hospital in this respect? So the distinctiveness of a university is the knowledge that it produces and disseminates through teaching to students, communication with society, through research and the impact it has. And this requires enhanced reflexivity in understanding the bases and limits of our claims to know the social world. So in this book, we developed this thesis, questioning the search for certainty that has traditionally characterized the scientific and social scientific enterprise. Reflexivity takes account of the idea that intelligence admits of error, that we may have falsely identified or misrecognized an object, concept, or experience. Questioning in this way can often be seen, of course, as a subversive act, particularly amongst those who hold cherished beliefs in the idea that there is some kind of absolute or total truth. And as we write in the introduction to this book, reflexivity is a guard against what we might call a hypodermic realism. That is the assumption that there is an unproblematic relationship between us and a singular world, including social scientific practices and its products, which results in a valid and reliable representation of that world. So if social science is to contribute to beneficial transformations for those most in need, then it must be aware of the conditions, contexts, and consequences of its own production. Yet often, and certainly when we were writing this book in the 2000s, there was not enough modesty or honesty about the limits of our tools, ways of seeing, and claims about knowledge. So it's these projects and these critiques that initially led me, at least, to care about co-production. Whilst the knowledge economy presented a kind of acquisitional mode of urban development, you know, like tick off these assets and you'll have a great city, or a product one in which universities commercialize new products or spin-off appliances for market, I started to wonder whether co-production could deliver processes of knowledge production and mobilization to address some of those chronic urban injustices whilst taking conditions, contexts and limits of academic expertise seriously. Oh, interesting. Seem to have a technical error. I'll just come off that and try again another way. Right, we're all good to go. Sorry about that. So it's with this hope that I sought to move rather grandly, probably naively, beyond critique. Some of you might remember that that was the talk I gave to you all when I was first invited to come and pitch for my job at Sheffield University. And to go and try and go beyond these critiques of the urban knowledge economy and the roles of universities to learn by doing about co-production. Through a series of projects I later represented with admittedly more coherence than they actually had as the Realising Just Cities programme. And this programme provided a fertile ground for me to try, fail, maybe partially succeed in putting co-production into practice, along with many, many colleagues and collaborators inside and outside the university, who I'll try to do some justice to today, but apologies if you're listening or present and I don't specifically name check you. It's been a ride. I'll only give a whistle-stop tour today, but downstairs in the foyer we have got a range of outputs and publications, and if you want to contact me, if you're online to find out more about anything, you're very welcome. So I cut my teeth with a project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council as part of their Connected Communities programme, along with research fellow Dr. Jessica Simons. This project was located in Odsal in Salford, an area of the city on the edges of the iconic media city development in Salford Quays, but which had not ostensibly benefited from the creative city dream. Initially, we aimed to look at how different processes of cultural intermediation might better connect local residents into the creative economy and benefit from media city developments. But after being told in no uncertain terms to fuck off, and that's a quote so I can say it, we redesigned the project, devolved as much funding as we could, and worked with local residents and cultural organisations to support their ideas for Odsal. This included everything from bike repair, beekeeping, a new community Facebook page, a billboard, a pop-up art shop, etc. So we haven't set out to co-produce this project, but this is what happened. The final project looked nothing like the plan, which we'd submitted for funders. We worked closely with people as co-researchers in the project, and there was a high chance of failure. Indeed, some of these projects did not work. But for me, this was an important lesson in letting go and testing the flexibilities of funding streams to do research differently. Local people reported they'd been validated and had their expertise and ideas valued. Some were inspired to go back to university to do their own research. Others were motivated to become community activists and seek to input and change local cultural development plans. So around the same time, we got involved in an international centre called Mistra Urban Futures. This centre, funded by the Mistra Foundation for Environmental Research and the Swedish International Development Agency, along with stakeholders in Gothenburg and partner cities, aimed to co-produce research for more sustainable urban transitions. The model relied on the constitution of local interaction platforms, which were intended to bring different stakeholders together to define research questions and approaches, deliver research and achieve high local impact. And these local interaction platforms, or LIPs, as we started calling them, were set up in Gothenburg, in Manchester originally, and then sort of tentatively brought to Sheffield, in Kusumu in Cape Town as well. So we were joined in the local interaction platform by researchers Dr. Sophie King, Nick Taylor-Buck, Bert Russell, Vicky Habermel, Christina DeProse and Charlie Spring. And a standout project for me was Sophie King's project on community-led organising, seeing the inner city from the south. This project spoke to ideas in post-colonial urban theory about finding new ways to engage with contemporary urban challenges in the global north by seeing from the south, as Vanessa Watson wrote in her 2009 article in Urban Studies of the same name. So this action research was co-designed by Sophie in partnership with Mumsmart and Lower Broughton Savers, two women-led community associations based in Manchester and Salford respectively. And the research built on a series of international exchanges with South African and Kenyan affiliates of the international social movement Shack Slum Dwellers International, whose members follow a bottom-up resident-led approach to neighbourhood development, which starts with women's-led savings. Following the end of the project funding and Sophie's contract, Sophie left Sheffield University and set up a new charity off the back of the research, Community-Led Action and Savings Support, which now aims to mobilise a women's-led savings movement for community savers across Greater Manchester, the north of England, including Sheffield, and the UK. And their stated mission now is to support, develop and facilitate women-led community and co-production processes focused on poverty reduction. So what do I take from all of this? This particular project revealed important insights about the specific value of academics within these kinds of grassroots co-production projects, namely to mobilise and support, to legitimise and bring forth existing expertise within communities. Importantly, this project also highlighted the burden of a narrowly construed ideal of co-production, where we do everything all together, all at the same time, on time-poor, resource-stretched, and often exhausted residents living in low-income communities, following decades of austerity policies here in the UK. People often didn't have the time or energy to be doing research for the sake of it as part of a participatory fad, unless such research was directly improving their own conditions. And so I think this raises a lot of questions around the kind of potential performativity of co-production, necessitating not necessarily the giving over of academic roles in knowledge production, but the alliance of those roles to wider social goals. Overall, my experience in Mr. Urban Futures was quite critical in understanding some of these questions about why we should care about co-production. For example, there were differing ideas of co-production across disciplines, international contexts, sectors, and very different diverse practices and methods. I was never quite sure we were actually talking about the same thing. In fact, I'm pretty sure we weren't most of the time, or at least a lot of the time. And at the same time, the organisation of and for co-production was critically important in determining whose interests were served via differing organisational configurations. So the Swedish partners, for instance, prioritised a formal consortium with city partners and county governments with very few civil society groups involved. In Greater Manchester, we decided instead to mobilise the intermediary space created by the university in order to avoid over proximity with local officials to whose interests we did not want to be beholden. And as a result, we were able to mediate between different groups with a more activist orientation and achieve greater civil society representation. Equally at stake in this project in particular was the critical role of professional intermediaries, such as my excellent colleague, Vicky Simpson, who amply demonstrated the importance of professional intermediation from within the university in order to overcome micro barriers, manage institutional contradictions, and quite simply get things done. So in terms of making co-production happen, that really matters. So the creation of intermediary or boundary spaces was the explicit aim of the subsequent project then, funded by the ESRC and Mr. Urban Futures, called Jam and Justice, Co-producing Governance for Urban Innovation. So this time the academic team included my colleagues at respectively Liverpool and Manchester University, Catherine DeRose and Liz Richardson, and researchers Drs. Bert Russell, Dan Silver, Suzanne Martika and Iona Hine, as well as a partnership with the Greater Manchester Centre for Voluntary Organisation. And the heart of Jam and Justice was the establishment of an Action Research Collective, or ARC, bringing together residents and professionals from different walks of life in Greater Manchester to test and learn about different approaches to make devolution matter, to get citizens more involved in decision making. And the ARC co-initiated 10 action research projects on topics from spatial planning, youth participation, public procurement, care at home, or energy democracy. But throughout this work, the same themes started to emerge, of course. The negotiations required to work across boundaries, differing perspectives on the relations between knowledge and action, the challenge to conventional academic roles, for instance, in leadership of complex multi-stakeholder research projects. And again, we found that participants concluded that their experience had been very different from those that they had had before in previous academic projects. But even after 4 years of doing this with us, they couldn't really explain what co-production was. They just knew we'd sort of done it. So we'd identified a set of design principles across the action research projects. This is this co-produce acronym here, to capture the kind of principles that we thought mattered in co-production, whether in research or in governance. And increasingly, I started talking about co-production not as a method, but as a set of practices that relied on existing tried or tested methods that might or might not realise these kinds of principles. So in Jam and Justice, there was no kind of purist ideal of co-production, no sort of magical flattening of antecedent power relations or overcoming of traditional roles. Co-production was messy, complex, uncertain and unknown, characterised by kinds of fluctuations between control and direction towards project goals and a letting loose in which surprise and the unanticipated were learned to be embraced. And it's worth just saying a little bit about the kinds of impacts of this work, because while some impacts were very concrete, such as, for instance, support for citizen engagement, shaping the Greater Manchester 5-year environment plan with PhD researcher Ryan Bellinson, many impacts were often processual, difficult to codify and hard to attribute, and largely sought to create networks, bolster capacities, set things in motion, put new ideas on the table or open up alternative possibilities. They were about, in some ways, the rewiring of the basis for what constitutes city regional intelligence. And I'll come back to this later. So we're nearly at the end of my tour of the projects. And at stake here really is the question of whose knowledge matters. This brings me to a project of the same name with Vicky Habermel and Professor Tim May, which looked at contested and competing knowledge claims for sustainable cities funded by both the SRC and Mistra Urban Futures. So this was not a co-production project in its design, but sought to mobilise the legitimacy and privilege of the university to make alternative knowledge claims and citizen expertise visible. And we did this through parallel processes of mapping. First, mapping processes of strategic spatial plan making around the points of policy development where different kinds of expertise were included or excluded from the process of making the Greater Manchester Spatial Plan. And second, mapping locally grounded citizen expertise within a particular neighbourhood in Miles Platting. This took the form of a counter-cartography project delivered by Vicky with collaborators Liz Mason-Dease and Dan Farley, which produced an exhibition in Manchester Central Library as part of the Manchester Histories Festival. So from this project, with an emphasis on contested knowledge claims and the ossification and impermeability of existing municipal institutions to different forms of expertise, this project acted as a challenge to the consensus bias of co-production and highlighted the dangers of capturing citizen expertise in the name of elite agendas, underpinned by what we might see as a kind of idealised normative model or concept of a particular kind of citizen. So it's only a short step from asking whose knowledge matters. You can see I kind of like these titles, to asking whose heritage matters. I'm sure I can probably get another funded project just playing on that theme. And this project was funded by the British Academy under their Sustainable Development Programme. Whose heritage matters involved, again, Vicky Habermel and also doctors Rika Zetas, Freda Dede and Patrick Hyombe. And this was intended to be a co-production project to explore the tensions and opportunities to map, make and mobilise cultural heritage for sustainable livelihoods in Kisumu and Cape Town. So the intellectual contributions of this project to my understanding of co-production are twofold. First, the project opened up questions of co-productive urbanism as a distinctive comparative perspective. If co-production is about valuing different forms of expertise and enabling projects to be shaped locally in context, with the aim of both democratising processes of knowledge production and achieving greater impact, then projects are going to deviate in their implementation locally. So this brings co-production into dialogue with contemporary debates on comparison within urban studies, as designs, methods, and even substantive topics often deviate locally from any kind of standardised design. We have to think of comparison differently as tactics following Jennifer Robinson's work, as strategy following Colin McFarlane and Michele Lancioni's work, or juxtaposition following the work of Abdi Malik Simone. So co-production potentially offers one response to this challenge by valuing and prioritising situated knowledges and delivery of research by local teams aligned with their existing mobilisations and trajectories. And second, whilst co-production is often based on localised alliances and partnerships, Whose Heritage Matters brought to the fore the relations between academics in different northern and southern contexts, particularly during the pandemic, where planned proximate collaborations could not take place due to different local lockdowns, rules and regulations. And so this brought to the fore the kind of questions around the ability to renegotiate funding allocations, the differential impacts on partners in parts of the world and at different stages of their career. And that all draws attention much more to the global politics of knowledge production and the particular assumptions that funders make. And finally, this brings me back to Sheffield and some current work I'm continuing in an area of the city called Arbourthorne. I've been working with Arbourthorne Community Primary School since 2019, along with Dr. Lee Crooks, to mobilise the school as community infrastructure within the context of a project called An Even Better Arbourthorne. An Even Better Arbourthorne is an initiative based at the school and aims to address the root causes of hardship by bringing new ideas and solutions into the community. And the approach of An Even Better Arbourthorne is to try and support community capacity building through poverty reduction, engaging with families and communities, seeing the school as the kind of hub of the community. A lot of that's around volunteering and following initiatives that matter to the community to make Arbourthorne even better while celebrating what already exists. And that's involved the projects from sort of improving the physical infrastructure of the school, like building a polytunnel growing area or outdoor classroom, to projects to improve people's mental health and overcome social isolation. So my role in this project has been as a kind of critical friend or learning partner to support the co-production of the project and ensure that the voices of volunteers are heard. But as well as myself, university colleagues in the School of Education, Architecture, Medicine and Urban Studies and Planning are all actively involved working with the school. And so for me, the opportunity here is to connect both research and teaching and mobilise the institution, the University of Sheffield, and its power and privilege to build long-term sustained co-productive partnerships. So, drawing on this work, I'm going to try now and highlight 5 potential answers to the question, why should urbanists care about co-production? And I definitely do this as an invitation to discuss, not to flatten or suggest that these are the right or the only answers. So first, co-production has descriptive power in relation to how cities are continuously being made and unmade. The co-production of cities reflects urban theories that recast the ontology of the city as unsettled, broken, or fragmented. As fundamentally uncertain and constantly shifting, cities are being co-produced by human and non-human actors and things, between subjects and objects, between physical and virtual artifacts, between infrastructures and bodies. Following Abdu Malik Simon's work, cities around the world, but particularly in southern contexts, are characterised by these ongoing processes of city making, in which everyday life and experience is co-constituted through a myriad of interactions between people, things, and places. So co-production coheres with this kind of different ontology of the city and accords, as Malik once put to me once, if not with our writings, but with our experiences and with all the effective registers and discordant chimes that characterise urban life. So it kind of captures an urban that is always and already being co-produced, a site of struggle and contestation, which enables different human, non-human or counter-human views of how and with whom we share and make urban space. And so this ontology has epistemological implications. Co-production has commonly been said to be a response to wicked problems as a post-normal science, where, as Silvio Funtowitz and Jerome Revetz have written, facts are uncertain, values are in dispute, stakes are high, and decisions are urgent. So co-production of research then involves the recognition of the indispensable role of practical knowledge, informal processes, and improvisation in the face of unpredictability. What co-production offers in relation to this uncertainty and unsettling is a modesty about the knowledge claims that academics alone can make about the city. As just as the city is in bits and pieces co-produced by different processes and never settled, then perhaps we too can only see fragments here and there. The argument would then go that only by valuing other forms of expertise can we hope to produce any knowledge, however partial and fragmented, about the urban. So a first proposition is that urbanists should care about co-production because cities are being co-produced. We need to understand how and in what ways, both as a substantive topic of inquiry and as an unsettling to our own knowledge claims. Second then, we should care about co-production because it is being both claimed and demanded within the context of participatory urban governance and informal movements and associations to demand the right to the city. As critical scholars of the urban, it is necessary for us to understand how co-production is being positioned within discourses of democratic participation at the urban level, by whom and with what effects. The co-production of urban governance has been claimed by some to be the highest rung of citizen participation, building on Sherry Arnstein's classic ladder of participation. At the heart of these kinds of claims is the idea that co-production is a response to a democratic deficit and can somehow fix the flaws of existing participatory methods, which tokenistically include citizens in processes at the edges of decision making without any real transfer of power. So co-production has kind of become a mobilizing discourse for decision makers, recognizing that what they have been doing isn't really working and looking for something else to address the deficits of existing participatory methods. You can see on the map there, across England, Scotland and Wales, there have been numerous examples of local authorities sticking their little pin in co-production. This is pre-pandemic, at least. And in other contexts, there's also evidence of increasing municipal authorities' experiments with co-production. But drawing on our research in Greater Manchester, for instance, Vicky Habermehl and I coined the phrase austerity co-production to draw attention to the institutional conditions within city regional governance in England, which delimit and undermine the potential for co-production. We define austerity co-production as a weak form of collaborative governance characterised by resource scarcity and fragmented multiple forms of expertise. This was further revealed in another set of interviews I did with Bert Russell, with elite decision makers in Greater Manchester, where co-production was being mobilised as yet another form of participatory statecraft, enrolling citizens to enhance the legitimacy and effectiveness of the local state. And in those kinds of processes, only particular, idealised and compliant citizens are really welcome, rather than those advocating a different system entirely. So co-production is kind of labelled and claimed by municipal officials, but often not exemplified in practice. But for many, that doesn't mean throwing like the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. Co-production is also part of a set of demands within movements and associations seeking to reclaim the city. Again, Bert and I have been working to try and contrast the municipal form of co-production that we see within local authorities with a more municipalist one. Municipalist co-production would perhaps be informed by new forms of municipalism and autonomous organising, reshaping state society relations from below. And that gives rise to a more radical, potentially more transformative orientation to co-production, where we see the city as more in flux, unsettled and transitional. And here the state might play a role, but is decentered, recognising instead the kind of fundamental primacy of non-state actors and community groups in undertaking co-production on their own terms, and sometimes against state priorities. So in a more radical perspective, co-production can be seen as a process of commoning rather than a tool of participatory statecraft, as a strategy for building the urban commons or taking ownership of public infrastructure and services in new forms of public common partnership. So this second proposition is that we should care about co-production as a form of participatory urban governance, a strategy for the urban poor to self-organise or realise the commons, because it is being mobilised by those in power and demanded by those who are not. And it's part of our role as critical urban studies scholars to kind of study those meanings and applications in use and their social and political ramifications. So both of these first two propositions suggest a distance and imply more or less traditional roles for academics to analyse how cities are made and remade and how concepts are being deployed by whom and with what effect. So they turn co-production into a substantive topic of inquiry. And this is important. But in my work, I've increasingly reframed co-production as a strategy to realise urban epistemic justice, requiring different tactics and processes of knowledge mobilisation. The literature on the just city has largely focused on procedural or distributive justice, put simply, how decisions are made and who benefits from them. But co-production, I'd argue, is primarily implicated in the search to address what Miranda Fricker has called epistemic injustice and engage with power and the ethics of knowing. And her focus on just injustice is really deliberate, to challenge the impression that justice is the norm and injustice the aberration. And she talks about epistemic injustice being when some harm is done to someone in their capacity as a knower, and identifies two different kinds of harms. The first being testimonial injustice, which is basically when you don't give someone credibility for what they say. So for instance, if the police don't believe you because you're black. And the second is hermeneutical injustice, which is more where the concepts and ideas don't exist to enable you to articulate your claim or your epistemic injustice in the first place. So the example in the book that she gives is that one might suffer sexual harassment in a culture that does not have a concept or word to describe that. So I'd argue that co-production is primarily about enhancing the credibility of different people as knowers in their own right. That is testimonial justice, but perhaps also holds the possibility for hermeneutical justice through the development of different concepts or ideas that accord with people's actual experiences and enable them to vocalise epistemic injustice in the first place. And drawing on some of the Mr. Urban Futures work, I would argue that some of the strategies we can use to advance urban epistemic justice help us to unbundle and unsettle existing forms of city regional intelligence. And this kind of heuristic comes from work that I've been doing with Warren Smith in Cape Town, where we looked across our different local interaction platforms to identify some of the different kinds of strategies and tactics that academics could use. And a lot of these are about trying to unsettle, create little ruptures, intervene in different kinds of processes, take people out of contexts or put them into contexts in order to kind of constitute what we might hope to be part of a counter movement for urban epistemic justice. The impacts of this kind of work are also often very intangible, and this is a common reflection. It's in a multi-authored paper that Vanessa's led in Current Research in Environmental Sustainability, a team working on urban equality found that co-production can help to establish long-term adaptable partnerships to deliver urban equality. However, such processes require constant adjustment and trade-offs to achieve that equality. And so in some ways, those kinds of transformative impacts are not always measurable, even when that role in social change is very evident. And we found the same thing in Mr. Urban Futures. Impacts included shaping policy processes, opening imaginations, enabling translocal learning, as well as stimulating infrastructures for action and capacity building. For many of the people we worked with, a kind of sense of self-efficacy and belief were the primary outcomes of working with us through co-productive projects. But the primary kind of outcome of many of these processes was a collective process of a collective diagnosis and problem reformulation as the basis for action. And I think this kind of collective problem reformulation, the assembling of evidence for urban alternatives in search of urban epistemic justice, was perhaps the most important outcome of many of these projects, and leads me to the next proposition. So if we can take as a descriptive fact that cities are being co-produced, and we accept that co-production is a strategy for epistemic justice, we open up the possibility that urban, sorry, just check the time, that we open up the possibility of new epistemologies of the urban. The suspicion of self-proclaimed critical urbanists towards co-production is partly founded in concern that if co-production gets too close, it loses its critical edge. It might be co-opted or captured. But this is based on a kind of traditional view of critique that sees academics as distanced, impartial observers of a singular world that can be understood if one deploys the right methods. We know, though, that for many scholars, our positions and belonging in the world do not undermine, but rather constitute our experience and validate our claims to know in the first place. So rather than stand in opposition to critique, co-production enables the very construction of critique in the first place. And I think some of the ideas of people like Luc Boltanski are really helpful here, providing a basis for this argument. He contends that ordinary people are not sunk in illusion, but have critical capacities themselves in situations of everyday life. What this means is that a framework should pay attention to the activities and critical competencies of actors and acknowledgement of the pluralistic expectations, which in contemporary democratic capitalist societies seem to occupy a central position in the critical sense of actors, including the most dominated among them. So a kind of alternative framing of critique does not constrain it to the domain of professionalized academic expertise. Rather than disputing common sense, we are all capable of critique. And this means valuing common sense in everyday practices beyond the institution, as well as paying attention to what Latour said as to how we can repair, take care, assemble, reassemble, and stitch together. These kinds of modes of organizing, of gathering, convening, assembling in different kinds of spaces are what brings collective critique forward. So the role then of the critical and engaged academics to enhance these kinds of capacities. And what that means is that academics are decentered within co-production, but their role in the production of critique does not disappear. Rather, there's a need for what Elizabeth Anker and Rita Felsky call an alternative ethos, mood, or disposition. That means acknowledging a different subjectivity and positionality. It means that there's no kind of we from within the academy that holds some kind of privileged position to reveal oppressions to the non-experts. So within critical urban theory, the relations between thought and action, negativity and proposition are not posited as oppositional. Henri Lefebvre was a pioneer of critical urban theory, called attention to the emancipatory potential within urban society and the right to the city to explore the possible impossible. And his critique of everyday life deployed an idea of critique that sought to open up different ways of thinking and living. So in that kind of tradition, and following the work of people like Neil Brenner, critical urban theory has no problem with the propositional mode, insofar as it insists that another, more democratic, socially just and sustainable form of urbanization is possible, even if such possibilities are currently being suppressed through dominant institutional arrangements, practices, and ideologies. So urban critique is not claiming distanced objectivity, but it is explicitly normative in its demand for an interrogation of the ends of knowledge. And what Brenner and his colleague Christian Smith conclude is needed is a new epistemology of the urban, recognizing that, and I quote, "The urban is a collective project. It is produced through collective action, negotiation, imagination, experimentation, and struggle. The urban society is thus never an achieved condition, but offers an open horizon in relation to which concrete struggles over the urban are waged, it is through such struggles ultimately that any viable new urban epistemology will be forged. So what is co-production, if not at least the possibility of putting a new urban epistemology into practice, grappling as it already is with uncertainty, messiness, and incompleteness? And so perhaps co-production picks up precisely where critical urban theory leads us, not by refusing or being against critique, but by co-producing critique in the first place. Okay, so my last proposition is that co-production is distinctive in its refusal to bracket how we do our research from the wider institutional and sector conditions required to do it. So co-production as a strategy for urban epistemic justice requires different negotiations and relations with our institutions, not like acts of refusal or denial of institutional privilege, but recognition of the myriad ways in which we are tethered to our universities. And that means challenging institutional power, but also seeking to harness it. As epistemic praxis, co-production seeks to contest knowledge claims and recognise the legitimacy of different types of expertise. Again, following in the vein of Abdul-Malik Simone and Edgar Peterse's work, producing a shared critique as the basis for collective action through a strategy which plays with both engagement and distance suggests what they call moves, which academics can make in mobilising and forming collectives and coalitions. And these kinds of moves should aim to overcome what Fred Harney and Stefano Moten in their pivotal work on undercommoning have called the negligence of critical academics. So often co-production is seen to entail the dismissal of academic expertise, not least by researchers themselves. I'd certainly say that in the early part of doing all of this work, I often sought to erase myself and was not comfortable with taking the position with being an academic, with holding that identity. But this distancing can inadvertently undermine academic legitimacy and the value that partnerships with universities hold for groups involved. So I'd argue that choreographing the university into rather than out of the landscape of knowledge co-production is an important move, but we can't quite rip up the rule book much as we might want to. And so that requires a different kind of praxis, where praxis is about reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it, but also, as Bernard Harcourt writes, a political and ethical form of being, which sees critical theory and praxis relentlessly confronting each other. And reflecting on my experience, I see this praxis as having involved three different things. When I look back on my experience in all of those projects, I can't see particular methods that I've used consistently at any moment in time. It's this kind of stuff that is the theme that characterises this work. First, it necessitates boundary work to navigate inflexible funding regimes or contractual requirements, and designing boundary spaces that retain proximity to and distance from the university at the same time. Second, it needs epistemic choreography to intermediate between different knowledge claims through mobilising the position of the university to legitimise different ways of knowing. And that's quite tricky sometimes to know when and how to mobilise that position of being an academic within that epistemic choreography. And third, it requires triple shifting. This idea draws on gender and feminist studies, for instance, Jean Duncombe and Dennis Marsden's work, which highlight the ways in which working women encounter a triple burden of their paid employment, their domestic labour in the home, and emotional care work, including for children or within the community. And drawing on this metaphor, in co-productive research, the first shift is the labour for academics of meeting institutional and sector expectations of doing one's job. The second shift is undertaking engaged work collaboratively with others, even though this may not be recognised or even supported by the institution. And the third shift is the emotional and relational labour and care work that comes with working with individuals, not as research participants, but as human beings. And here I'm also thinking of some work I'm developing with Vanessa, Rika and Zarina Patel on effective infrastructures in international co-production projects, which value alliance building, allyship and activism as a kind of challenge to the hegemonic knowledge assumptions embedded in formal global north, global south partnerships. So through these propositions, I'm trying to offer perhaps a distinctive take on co-production within urban studies. As an object of inquiry, this sees co-production as both aligning with the ontological unsettling of the city and the claims and demands made by different state and civil society actors for its active co-constitution. It then emphasises how co-production as a strategy for urban epistemic justice is a response to the need for new epistemologies of the urban through the co-construction of critique. And finally, it refuses to bracket off the conditions and institutions of knowledge production from the knowledge that we produce. So let me just end by reflecting on why co-production, caring about co-production as urbanists, is necessary but not sufficient to understand and transform the relations between knowledge, action and the city. And these closing demands are designed to open up a wider agenda around urban epistemics, which we'll all hopefully collectively return to in the final session on the 14th of December. So the first limitation I want to highlight is what I'm calling contradictory epistemic myopia. And what I'm trying to get at here is that despite its claims to transdisciplinarity, co-production has been largely monopolised by the arts and humanities and social sciences, and tends to ignore certain forms of data and spatial intelligence that are central to understanding the forces and processes shaping cities and urban life. The politics of urban expertise prioritises a particular understanding of city science, which is being expanded through new forms of remote sensing, artificial intelligence, data processing and automation. Co-production is not only marginal in the face of the hegemony of hard data, but contradicts itself in excluding particular forms of intelligence and expertise. Second, co-production is conceptually muddy and ambiguous, and it has been argued that it's so overused and misappropriated that it's of little use. Lots of things that aren't co-production are claimed as such, and many things that look like co-production don't describe themselves that way. So this has led me, with my colleagues Catherine DeRose and Liz Richardson, to ask whether co-production is even a good concept. We concluded, helpfully as academics, that it depends. If the criteria for a good concept is to clarify, then co-production clearly fails this test, with a multiplicity of meanings, uses and interpretations. If a good concept is one that has relevance and resonance across multiple fields, and our role then is to elucidate those meanings in particular contexts, then co-production is no better or worse than any other concept. And if a good concept is one that provokes and agitates, opening up new questions with an interpretive flexibility that enables different discussions to be had, then co-production probably meets this criteria quite well. Of course, as urbanists, we work with many concepts that are not perhaps good by some of these criteria, including governance, sustainability, and some would argue intersectionality. And in the propositions I've tried to advance here, I've tried to reclaim co-production as a useful concept within urban studies through thinking about how it is used and what it means for how we act and produce knowledge. But apart from the arguments I might make, in my personal experience, co-production can get in the way of intellectual discussions with others in the field, at the cutting edge of urban studies and with urbanists beyond the academy. It can confuse as much as it clarifies. And I've increasingly found that the concept does not offer a strong or precise enough basis for me to engage with the work of many of my colleagues that I most admire, even sometimes within my own institute. So the third limitation is consensual fallacy. Even though co-production is grounded in uncertainty and messiness and takes kind of unpredictability and unknowability as a condition of the world, it still kind of contains within it this logic of resolution. The impulse to resolve, integrate, unify is captured in definitions that emphasize the synthesis of diverse forms of expertise and the integration into new forms of knowledge that can somehow address wicked urban issues, as if they were never wicked in the first place. So while starting with kind of recognition of difference and diversity, a strong consensus bias can often emerge to co-produce something, to be certain about something, to manage out uncertainty. The risk here, I think, is that co-production, rather than grappling with uncertainty, performs closure and solidification. And this leads to my kind of final point today, the necessity but insufficiency of co-production to deal with questions of power, whether within institutions, when dealing with powerful urban groups and vested interests or global funding regimes. What does co-production have to say about capitalism, about global systems of control and surveillance, about catastrophic climate impacts, about systematic Black oppression? It is one potential strategy to overcome paralysis, I would say, in the face of such massive challenges. One might argue it's better to try something, even if one fails, than nothing. But a lot more is opened up if we think about urban epistemic justice more broadly, and a variety of different tactics to link knowledge to action. I'm thinking, like, for instance, could colleagues at the university, Adam Lever, John Silver and Rich Goulding, have co-produced their pivotal work on the selling off of public land in Manchester with the very decision makers that sold it? Could they have enrolled Saudi corporations in urban accounting of financial flows between Manchester and the Gulf states? I think other tactics of knowledge mobilisation and representation are required here. And furthermore, co-production has a localized bias and only partially reveals, and at times is complicit in reproducing, global epistemic hegemonies. New forms of what Walter Mignolo calls epistemic obedience subjugate Southern scholars to westernized ways of seeing and knowing. These were some critical themes brought to the table by our African partners within the New African Urban University Network we were part of, led by Zarina Patel at University of Cape Town. And Jakob Galuska also argues in his article in Planning Theory that co-production requires sharper theoretical frames if it is intended to be reflective of the basic strategies of the urban poor, to represent the view from the south or be influential in the sphere of planning. So finally, there's no escaping the power of our institutions, which can tend to capture co-production success stories as evidence of their civic engagement, whilst providing minimal support for their development or longevity. Co-production cannot relieve us of acknowledging that there is still far to go in developing engaged or civic institutions that take seriously the relations between knowledge and action, critique and engagement. And of course here, like how academic careers play into this is really important. Academic careers still tend not to be built on engagement, but often despite it, with particular consequences for early career researchers who are not always sufficiently supported to undertake the triple shift. So my kind of concern is if we eulogise co-production to the exclusion of other forms of knowledge production, which can contribute to urban justice, we fail to recognise the limits it has when faced with redressing some of these chronic issues. So to conclude, I will still practice co-production as a response to the critique I laid out in the first part of this lecture and the propositions that result from my work. I'll stay with the trouble, so to speak. I care about co-production because it helps me acknowledge how worlds are being co-produced and how we might seek to know them. Because it has enabled me to actively choose to be an academic 20 years after I became one. Because in my experience, it leaves participants in a better position in terms of the confidence, capability and capacity to act in their own situations than before. Because it is one part of the counter movement for urban epistemic justice against the economic instrumentality of the knowledge economy. And because it connects my own passion for intellectual ideas with my desire to contribute in some way to more just urban futures. But I am mindful of its blind spots, contradictions, misappropriations and limits. It's too narrow a starting point from which to engage with those academics across disciplines whose work I find most inspiring or the debates that are most critical. So this is why over the course of these lectures, I want to position co-production within the wider field of urban epistemics so that I can engage more, we can engage more with those who have experienced epistemic injustice but would never use the word co-production. So I'm really pleased that the next lecture will be given by Kavita Philip, whose radical interdisciplinarity engages with so many questions of epistemics and epistemology that has wider that has wider relevance for this series. Yes, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts, comments, and questions. Thank you.